Thank you, Christian, and it is an honor to be here. The truth is, Christian wanted another Air Force veteran just to give him a little support here tonight. Now, you know, we always have a lot of inter-service rivalry, but in our campaign we had veterans from all the branches, and we used to incite a little of that rivalry going on. And so I thought there for a moment, Christian, when you said, my dad is here and he's a U.S. Marine, so, and you paused, I turned, I said he was about to say, so use small words and speak slowly. That was for my Marine, or my Navy campaign supporter in the back. There you go. He was our token Navy guy. If we were at an event and I had Bob Weatherford, the city councilman down in Ackworth, who was running for the Cobb County Commission, and they were having veterans come out when they played their song, and so they started playing the Navy hymn, and I bumped him. I said, Bob, don't you need to go out there? He said, I'm a Marine. I said, the Marine's part of the Navy. He said, yeah, that's the men's department. So, but you know, that's one of the great things about America is that what I call American exceptionalism. Because we can have fun like that, but there is this understood respect among all veterans and those who are serving, because it is a team approach. When you look at our military today, and you go even in the special operations area, it is more common than not that there are members from multiple branches involved in the same operation. And that just shows what I call American exceptionalism. And that's what I want to speak to you just momentarily tonight, is about American exceptionalism and the four values that define American exceptionalism. And that is vision, values, leadership, and commitment. Before I do that, I want to commend Christian for having this event, continuing to have this event every year, because there are a lot of communities around this state and this nation that do not do the service that they should to our servicemen, and honoring what they do and what they have done. And I commend you, and I'd like to thank you for doing this. And I'll tell you that it's very tempting for a lot of politicians to try to use something like this as a fundraising event, because it's costly to run campaigns, but Christian has not done that, and he's done it to raise money for veterans causes. I was in Washington, D.C. Early on in the campaign in January, and I was named one of the top 5 candidates running for, conservative candidates running for federal office. And we were having a press conference, and while I was there, one of the reporters, after I gave my little 2-minute spiel, about 35, 40 members of the national press were in the room, and when I got done, one of the reporters, I think it was from Roll Call in Washington, D.C., came up to me and she said, hey, I heard what you said about Congress in Washington. They're out of touch, and that's why they're not popular. And she asked me, if Washington is so bad, why do you want to come here? And I said, well, to be honest with you, I really don't. She looked at me and she said, you don't want to come here? I said, no, ma'am, I don't even like politics. Well, I thought you served in the state house and state senate. I said, I did. But I don't like politics. I mean, think about it. What does it mean? Poly is many and ticks are blood-sucking parasites. And the political side of politics, you don't have to be in elected office to deal with politics. Anybody here go to church? Yeah, you're qualified to deal with politics, or any civic organization. But I love this nation. And I don't care for the way the nation has been going. And I told the reporter, I said, I'm coming here because my children deserve better than we're passing on to them. I could tell she still didn't understand, and I said, maybe the best way to explain it is this way. My dad was a World War II veteran, he was a medic, I'm a veteran. And when our guys are called into action, they're sent into a combat zone where bullets are being slung at them, they prefer not to go. Give them a choice, and a lot of them, they're motivated, they're trained, they psychologically prepare themselves to go into the heat of battle, but give them the choice of whether to go or not, they would choose not to. But they willingly go. not because of themselves, but because of something the next generation may have better than they did. And that's what I call American exceptionalism, is a willingness to sacrifice of your own self for someone else. It's the hallmark of this nation. The first value or the first characteristic of American exceptionalism is vision. If you go back to our founding fathers had a vision. They had a vision of something better than what they currently had. They were living in an oppressive society. They were living under tyranny. But they believed that they could do something better. And see, when you have a vision and you get focused upon that vision becomes a cause. And if you focus upon that vision and that cause, and not the circumstances around you, you can accomplish a lot of things. Now, our founding fathers in July of 1776, they left us a document defining their vision. Their vision was a government that was not ruled by the government, but that was ruled by the people. That the people chose their government, and they were empowered to change that government when they didn't like it. It had never been successfully tried in modern history. The only time it had worked before was in the desert with Moses. So our founding fathers modeled our new government after this, and it was pretty much understood it wouldn't last. But I want you to understand what they faced. Is those 56 men that were signing the Declaration of Independence, as they were about to put their pen on the paper, you need to understand that they were about to sign a death warrant. If they didn't succeed, they would surely be drawn, quartered, and hung. In fact, Benjamin Franklin, he stated, either we all hang together or we'll hang separately. Now, why would these men do what was impossible? Now, when I say it's impossible to accomplish this, because to accomplish this vision they had to take on the most powerful military force in the history of the entire world. Think about that for a minute. These ragtag rabbles, as the British Army called our semblance of an army, a bunch of ranchers and farmers and trappers and merchantmen who would grab their weapons and go out on a moment's notice to defend their liberties. They weren't a very well-trained army. We were outgunned, outmanned, outsupplied, outgeneraled. There was no possible way we could win against the most powerful army on the face of the earth. And in fact, when they were debating the Declaration of Independence, or the motion that was made by Richard Henry Lee that we should separate from England, there was momentum moving toward actually passing it, but the first vote had failed on July the 1st, 1774, and July the 2nd they had set up to make the second vote. They could feel the momentum was shifting in favor of independence, and the 4 colonies that had voted against it, 3 of them had agreed to come on board. But as they were debating it, there was one gentleman there, John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who was a highly respected man. And he was an ardent patriot, but he was a realist. And he understood what they were facing. He understood that it was physically impossible to defeat the most powerful military force in the history of the entire world. And as that momentum began to shift, he stood up and he made a very impassioned speech that we know today as the paper stiff speech. He basically said, if we are to attempt this, and I agree we should be an independent nation. I agree that we're living under tyranny and oppression. But now is not the time, because if we take on this powerful army, our towns will be ravaged, our people will be murdered, our children will be enslaved, savages will be let loose upon our towns, and we will be no better than a paper skiff in a raging river. John Jay was sitting next to John Adams. Or, I'm sorry, Benjamin Rush was sitting next to John Adams. And he leaned over to him and he said, Mr. Adams, do you believe that we can succeed in our fight against England? Without hesitation, John Adams leaned over and he said, yes. If we turn our eyes toward heaven, we pray and ask God to forgive us of our sins. That was his response. He cited 2 Chronicles 7:14. You see, John Adams had his eyes upon a cause, not the circumstances that surrounded it. If he focused on the circumstances as John Dickinson did, I'm sure he would have caved into that. But after that, John Adams stood up and he made the speech that shifted the momentum again. Liberty now and liberty forever. Because his eyes were upon his cause, not his circumstance. When you have vision, then you can overcome insurmountable odds. And that's American exceptionalism. The second thing that you have is values. You have to have a roadmap. You have to have a certain stated set of values that you stand by that guide you. Our founding fathers understood that as well, and in that same document they stated upon what values we were going to build this nation. In the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to another, and assume among the powers of the earth the separate but equal station for which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind dictate that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. You see, they stated in that first paragraph that as we build this new nation that the powers of the earth have given us the authority to do, we're going to build this nation on a set of values, and that set of values they defined as the laws of nature and of nature's God. See, Thomas Jefferson, when he penned that paragraph, he just went back to some existing documents, one that was written by William Blackstone, the Commentary on the Common Law. And William Blackstone defined the laws of nature as God's will as defined through nature, and the laws of nature's God as God's will as defined through Scripture. You see, our founding fathers said there is a set of values that they called the natural law, which William Blackstone defined as a set of laws that precedes man's laws and supersedes man's laws, such as thou shalt not kill. You see, they identified that regardless of what we do in this nation, there is a set of laws that's greater than anything that we can do. And those are the laws that existed before man existed, the laws of God. So you must have values to go along with your vision to keep you on track. Our founding fathers left us a set of values in the Declaration of Independence. The three documents that guided our nation into exceptionalism was the Bible, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution, and you cannot separate the three. The third, you must have leadership. That's where America has excelled. Because when your vision is articulated properly and your values are solid, leaders will naturally arise to take up the mantle of leadership. One of the greatest examples of that happened in 1776. In January of 1776, there was a pastor, John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, pastor of a church in Woodstock, Virginia. He had been doing something, pastor, that we're told today you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to mix politics in the pulpit. But you see, he believed a little differently, because he believed that idea that rebellion against tyranny is obedience to God. He believed that true liberty only comes through God, and he believed in this thing called the natural law. And he began preaching these ideas from the pulpit. Now, he was even condemned by superiors in his church, one of being his brother. You see, his grandfather was a pastor, his dad was a pastor, and of course, he and his brother were pastors as well. He had been actually trying to recruit through his church for people to go and join Washington in Cambridge, Massachusetts after the Battle of Bunker Hill. Washington had been assigned and he needed volunteers. And of course the people in Massachusetts, they were motivated because they had British troops on their soil, but the other colonies had not experienced that yet and were not willing to send their men and their boys to fight. But John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg had been preaching that it is our duty to defend liberty. So in the early January morning, he arrived at the church relatively early on a Sunday morning. Snow was on the ground. So he walked in, he took his clerical robe, he hung it up on the hook inside of his office, and he lit a fire for warmth, and he sat down and he began to prepare for his sermon. Now, word had gotten out about the controversy. The one thing I can tell you, when you're controversial, you'll pack your pews out. People have been leaving other churches, coming to that church to hear what Reverend Muhlenberg was going to say. But when I was a kid, my dad used to tell me about a pastor who tried to get people, this older gentleman that lived next door to the church, tried to get him to come to the church every Sunday. And he would tell them about every program they had and their Christmas cantata, and no matter what he did, he couldn't get that gentleman to come to church. The pastor got a call at 2 o'clock in the morning one morning, said, "You need to come to the church now." He pulled up to the church and parking lot, and the church was engulfed in flames. And he turned and he looked, and that old gentleman was standing in the parking lot watching the church burn. The pastor walked over to him. He said, "Let me just ask you a question." He said, "All these years I've been trying to get you to come to our church and you would never come. Why did you choose to come now?" He said, "Because, Pastor, your church never been on fire before." You see, Muhlenberg had the town on fire, and they were there. But word had gotten out that this was going to be a different sermon than any others, and so it was actually filled to capacity. Muhlenberg was hearing the rumblings inside of the sanctuary, and so he propped open the door and he looked out there, and the church was filled, and he saw that it was time to start the sermon. So he grabbed the robe off the hook, he put his clerical robe on, he ascended to the pulpit, and people who were there wrote in their journals that a hush fell over the entire congregation. It was so quiet, you could literally hear the footsteps of the mice up in the rafters. Reverend Muhlenberg opened his Bible to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and he started preaching on there is a time for everything. And as he continued to preach for 45 minutes on into an hour, a relatively short sermon for that time period, he finally got to a point. He closed his Bible, he stepped back from the pulpit, and he said, "The Holy Scriptures have told us there's a time for everything. There's a time for war, and a time for peace, a time for love, a time to hate, a time to sow, and a time to reap. But I say, there is a time to preach, and then there's a time to fight." With those words, he removed his clerical robe and revealed the uniform of a colonel in the Continental Army. He descended from the pulpit, and he walked to the back door, and he opened the door, and a drummer began drumming the call to recruits. Reverend Muhlenberg turned around and said, "Who will join me this day in the fight for liberty?" 350 men and boys left their homes that day, that afternoon, and marched off with Colonel Muhlenberg, creating the 8th Virginia Regiment. You see, when your vision is articulated properly and your values are correct, leaders will arise. Muhlenberg became a very key component. He ended up being a general. He served with Washington through Valley Forge and was a key component in the Christian revival that happened in Valley Forge, which George Washington said was the turning point in the American Revolution. He went on to serving at Yorktown. He went on to serving in politics. But leaders will arise when their eyes are on their cause and not their circumstance. And finally is commitment. And commitment is the one thing that is really, really difficult for people to understand or comprehend. And there have been books that have been written on what's the difference between dedication and commitment. In fact, when I was in the Air Force, it was tried to be explained to me one day the difference between dedication and commitment, and they talked about a breakfast plate. And they say, well, the chicken was dedicated, but the pig was committed. You see, the pig gave everything. The chicken gave, but continued on to give more. Well, I thought that was a little lighthearted. I still wanted to find out the definition of commitment, and as I was studying history, I found an incredible story. It was actually World War II, the British Army. When they were trapped at Dunkirk, outnumbered by superior German forces, they were pushed up against the English Channel. There was absolutely no hope for them. The British Navy could not come across the channel and rescue them because they were engaged in the North Sea. So the British High Command sent a coded message into their commander and said, "It will be honorable. We would not consider it dishonorable if you surrender to save the lives of your men." The British commander responded with a coded message. It's just 3 words. "But if not." That's all it said, "but if not." Now the amazing thing is that word got out through all of England, and everyone then knew exactly what he was talking about. You see, he was referring to Daniel chapter 3, the 3 Hebrew children, who they were put in a similar position. They were told either you bow to the image or you'll be thrown into the fiery furnace. And they responded and said, King, we know the authority that you have, so we're going to be very careful in the way that we respond to you, because we do honor and respect your authority. But there is a higher authority that we must own up to, higher than you. And if you decide to throw us in the furnace, we believe God will protect us. But if not, we still won't bow. You see, the commander was saying, we know this could end up in our destruction, but we're not going to give in. Now, as the word got around England, people responded. They grabbed their fishing boats, their pleasure boats, anything that they could get, and they started across the English Channel, and they rescued their soldiers. You see, that story is just not unique to England, because there are numerous stories of American exceptionalism, of commitment. My dad is a World War II veteran, and he served in the Battle of the Bulge. And there were many instances, but two of those instances that just, I think, emanate American exceptionalism and commitment to a cause happened during the Battle of the Bulge. One of those happened in Bastogne. After the German army broke through the Siegfried Line in the middle of a snowstorm on December the 16th, 1944, you see, we thought the war was over. We had put green troops up on the front lines, and the Germans had secretly amassed their Panzer tanks and artillery. Our strength was in air power at the time. But they broke through the line like a hot knife through butter, and within a matter of minutes, the 106th Infantry Division ceased to exist. They were going through towns, and the GIs were in what they called the Great Bug Out, was a mass retreat. Eisenhower found out that the objective of the Germans was to reach the Meuse River, and the only way that they could get there was there were bridges. There were only two bridges that were strong enough to hold the weight of Panzer tanks, and they were in the towns of Bastogne and Saint-Vith. So he knew that the brunt of the German forces had to go through those towns. So he sent the 85th Airborne to the 82nd Airborne to Saint-Vith and 101st Airborne to Bastogne with the orders of hold the towns at all costs. General Anthony McAuliffe was the commander of the 101st Airborne, and literally arrived in Bastogne just a few hours before the Germans arrived and started the bombardment. He held off miraculously because the 101st Airborne was not equipped for battle. They had just come back to be refit into France when they were sent out, and they didn't have winter clothing. They didn't have any artillery. They had a few bazookas, but basically had 10 rounds of M1 ammunition for each soldier. And so it was literally rifles against tanks. After 4 days of heavy bombardment, the fighting ceased, and approaching the American lines were 4 Germans waving a white flag of truce. They were allowed to come up, and they said, we need to speak to the commanding general. Colonel Moore was summoned, who was General McAuliffe's chief of staff, and they took them all to the command post, and they were given an ultimatum of surrender. Colonel Moore then took the ultimatum, and he went to the headquarters, and he walked in to see General McAuliffe. And as he walked in, in his autobiography, he tells what happened. He said, I walked in with the ultimatum of surrender, and he said, General McAuliffe, we have an ultimatum of surrender from the Germans. He said, McAuliffe turned around and said, tell them we'll accept it. We'll accept their surrender. He said, no, sir, they're demanding our surrender. He said, us surrender? And he laughed. He said, nuts. Now, what's interesting about that is surrender was not in the vocabulary of General McAuliffe, because his orders were to hold the town at all costs, and he would not ever consider it. That's why he assumed they were surrendering to him. As they stood around and they discussed, well, sir, we have to respond to the Germans. He would have no discussion of surrender, even though they knew that basically all was lost. They said, General, we have to respond. And so they talked about proper response, and finally the lieutenant stood up and he said, sir, I think what you said a minute ago is most appropriate. He said, what's that? He said, nuts. So General McAuliffe just scribbled nuts on the surrender ultimatum, gave it to Colonel Moore, and he took it back to the Germans. He handed it to German captain, and the German captain looked at it, confused by this unique American phrase. He said, "Is this positive or is it negative?" Colonel Moore said, "Sir, it's defiantly negative." He said, "You will rue the day that you cost American and innocent civilian lives." As they were crossing back across the line, he said, Colonel Moore turned to him, he said, "Sir, you can tell your general, you try to take Bastogne, we will kill every German that tries to cross this line." They held Bastogne. But many of the American commanders that felt the force was overwhelming, they surrendered only to have their men massacred. You see, General McAuliffe did not believe in the idea, is this a hill I'm willing to die on? He believed, is this a hill that my enemy's willing to die to take? He had his eyes upon a cause, not a circumstance. One other story happened in St. Vith. As many of the GIs were retreating, they were jumping on any vehicle that had wheels or tracks. As tanks and jeeps and trucks would come through town, soldiers were jumping on those, heading back to the safety of the American lines to get behind the remaining force of Americans. And as a tank was coming through town after town, more soldiers were jumping on, and he was on a dirt road heading in to St. Vith. And as they were coming down the road, the tank commander looked, and there was a lone private was casually digging a foxhole by himself on the side of the road. The tank commander just wanted to make sure he's going in the right direction. Stops, he opens the hatch, he hollers out at the private over there. He said, "Private." He said, "Yes, sir." He said, "What's your name?" He said, "Private Martin." He said, "Is this the way to the lines? Is this our way to St. Vith?" And he said, "Sir, are you looking for somewhere safe?" The tank commander said, "Yes, I am." And Private Martin said, "Well, sir, pull that tank behind me. I'm 82nd Airborne, and this is as far as the Germans are going to get." So inspired by his willingness to stand, with his eyes upon his cause, not his circumstance, that tank commander ordered those soldiers off the tank and said, "This is where we'll make our stand." When the next group of soldiers came down the road, they heard about Private Martin's stand, and they said, "This is where we'll make our stand." And that continued throughout the day, and at one point became a stronghold against the German onslaught. That is American exceptionalism. That's commitment to a cause, not looking at your circumstance, looking at the cause for which you stand. That's the ethos of American exceptionalism. And that's what's taught in our military. And that's what many have sacrificed for. When I was first asked, "Why are you running for Congress?" I said, "Because my children deserve better than what we're passing on to them. Because too many people have sacrificed their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor for something. And it's up to us to stand on every battlefront, whether it's politics, whether it's in your community, whether it's in the school, or whether it's on the battlefield. We owe it to those who went before us." You see, our founding fathers understood that one commitment. They understood the idea of commitment. In fact, Thomas Jefferson modeled the last line of the Declaration of Independence after Daniel chapter 3. The last line of the Declaration says, "And in support of this Declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor." You see, what that means is, we know what we're about to do is impossible, but we believe God will deliver us. But if not, we dedicate our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. That's American exceptionalism. I believe American exceptionalism is still alive. I believe we're a sleeping giant, and I believe it's time to be awakened. I believe we can take this nation and get it back on course. President Garfield said, "Politics is downstream from culture, from society. If you want this nation to change and you're waiting on Washington to change it, it's never going to happen. Change begins here." These stories that we talked about, your experiences, must be shared. That's American exceptionalism. See, President Garfield said that if Washington or Congress is corrupt, or reckless, ignorant, and corrupt, it's because the people accept recklessness, ignorance, and corruption. Because we're the ones who send them there. Tuesday, you have an opportunity to express American exceptionalism. Tuesday, you have a responsibility. Because there are many that are dedicated to see this nation be restored. Our founding fathers had to resort to bullets. But we can have another revolution, not by bullets, but by ballots. But first of all, you have to be willing to vote. Second of all, you have to know who's on the ballot and what they stand for. See, the most dangerous person in America is not ISIS. It's not terrorism. The most dangerous person in America is an uninformed voter. The second thing is quit looking for a perfect candidate. They don't exist. Jesus was the only perfect man ever walked on the face of the earth, and until you walk into the voting booth and you see his name on the ballot, you're always going to vote for the lesser of two evils. And Christian, I'm sorry, I'm putting us in that category too. Now think about this. The power of your vote. Because Jesus was the only perfect man who walked on the face of the earth, the Son of God. And it was an uninformed majority that voted to have him crucified. Your vote matters. Turning the nation around begins today. It begins here. And there's not a more honored group that I'd rather stand with than the group that is here today. God bless you. Christian, thank you for having me here today. And God bless America. Thank you very much.